All right, so uh, we are in Revelation chapter 6 tonight. So, for introduction, I want to start off with a little bit of a word that I hope will make what we're about to read clearer, but may only make sense afterwards. So, most of the rest of the book, starting here in 6, is more what we think of when we think of the book of Revelation. John sees very strange, dramatic visions of things happening on earth and in heaven, and a lot of them are going to be visions of sort of terrible suffering. Um, so I think it can be helpful to ask here, um, what is going on in the scenes of destruction we're about to get? So we said last time that the famous four horsemen start in this chapter, and there are a few other things. We have this vision in our mind that Revelation is a book about God directly punishing the world, of God sort of doing bad things on the earth. And I don't think that's entirely true. A commentary that I like had a quote that said that for Revelation, the world's suffering is allowed by God, but caused by sin. I think that's going to be an important distinction from here on out. That much of what we see in the book of Revelation is going to be the natural outcomes of sin happening to the world and God giving the world over to what happens because of sin. God's judgment of sin and sin's natural consequences aren't necessarily different things. God tells us not to sin, in part at least, because sin is destructive. Sin can carry its own punishment with it. And God warns us against sin because God doesn't want us to be hurt by sin. You can think of it like a child touching a stove and getting burned. We wouldn't say that the parent punished the child when the child touched the stove and got burned. We would say that the child burned themselves because they didn't listen to their parents. A lot of what we're going to be reading here, not all of it, but a good portion, is I think more along the lines of that, a sort of creation touching the stove after it's been told not to. God warns us against doing what the people we're going to see here are doing because it's destructive and will hurt us. And so the effects of that are, in a sense, God's judgment. But God warned us against these things because they had these natural consequences. So I think that's going to show what I think is the best way to read these next chapters, and I'm hoping this will make a little more sense as we talk about them. The way that John intends us to read the book of Revelation, and the way that's going to be the most spiritually beneficial to us and keep us from sort of pointless or not helpful speculation, is to see these images that are about to come up as spiritual realities that are going to indicate things that are happening in every generation. Revelation is a story about how people reject God and choose sin, and how then sin goes on to harm and oppress the people, and how God comes in and makes judgment over that sin. This isn't a one time event that we're about to read here, but something that's going to happen constantly in a cycle until God finally breaks it. Like I said, I'm not sure this makes a lot of sense in the abstract, but I think you'll see what I mean when we start to read it. So remember last week in chapter 5, John saw God holding a scroll. We said that scroll is God's plan for creation. It's the plan to redeem the world and save the world from itself while it's trapped in sin. In chapter 6, the Lamb begins to open the scroll slowly, seal by seal. And as each seal on the scroll is broken, as we get closer and closer to the scroll being opened and being able to see God's plan for creation, the problems that creation is facing get clearer and clearer. As each of the first four scrolls are open, John is going to see horsemen all doing something bad. Let's read them and talk about them. A little more comes after. Um, and talk about kind of what John has in mind here, or what I think the sort of main takeaway from this vision is supposed to be. I think it's going to get a lot clearer and may not have helped by putting this all at the beginning. But let's start reading in Revelation chapter 6. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures call out, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." And I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. So the first seal is open. We get a little bit closer to seeing God's plan for the world. And the first thing we see is a rider on a white horse carrying a bow. Now, obviously, there's a lot of symbolism going on here. John's not saying that He expects us to look out the window one day and see in the sky a rider on a white horse carrying a bow and arrow. These series of horsemen represent things happening in the world. This white horse represents conquest, right? He's coming out to conquer, to conquer and to continue conquering. It's sort of a deceptive image. You might read this and think, kind of at the beginning, this is Jesus or something along these lines, right? A rider on a white horse, looking poised to conquer the earth. It sounds almost messianic. It also reminds me a lot of Rome in the way that Rome presented itself, promising peace through military conquest. It sounds messianic, but we have to look at kind of what follows afterwards. This is the first, like I said, of these series of seals that kind of show the problem the world is in. And the root of the problem is this human desire to conquer, to take things, to overcome weaker people. So let's read kind of the rest of these out and come and talk about them. When I opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that the people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. I think let's read all of these, and then it'll help to kind of come back and talk about them all. So in 5, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and it was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the oil or the wine." And when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. So these 4 horses, I think it makes the most sense when we read them as images describing the problem the world is in right now. The Lamb is opening the scroll to show how God is going to save the world. But to save the world, we need to see what the world needs to be saved from. And as the plight on earth gets a little bit clearer, we see these images that for John represent the sort of sum total of the problem that humanity is needing to be saved from. You have this white horse that is this sort of innate human drive to conquer. It goes out and just creates strife in the world. And after it comes this red horse that, conquering has to be based on violence. The human desire to conquer leads to war, to violence. And a black horse comes out, and it speaks of economic problems. It has this little statement with it, the quart of wheat for a day's pay, what is in a 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but don't damage the oil or the wine. I think, like I said, we're getting this train. We're sort of stringing along problems that sort of lead one into the other and reinforce each other. So the kings of the earth, these most powerful figures, go out to conquer. And when they conquer, they start wars, violence, bloodshed. And with these wars come poverty, is what the sort of third horse is. Denarius, the sort of literal reading of what it says there, your Bible probably either has a quart of wheat for a day's pay or a quart of wheat for a denarius. That's about 17 times higher than these goods would normally be. So it'd be something like if the horse came out and said a loaf of bread for $25, just sort of an outrageous inflated price. That you get this string of things where you have conquest leading into war and violence, and because of the war and violence, now there's poverty, but only for the sort of people on the lowest rung, right? The wine and the oil, the luxury goods, are left entirely alone, and so human inequality gets highlighted by this next one. Left to their own devices, these human systems that John is talking about become sinful and violent, and here exploitative. And they all lead into the last horse, the pale horse with a rider named Death, and with Hades following behind it. leading to all sorts of death by the sword, by famine, by disease, and by kind of nature. Like I said, for reasons that I think are clear here, but keep going on, the horsemen here don't really seem to represent any one event that's going to happen in the future. They aren't really coming events so much as they are descriptions of the human condition. That human in its humanness, that humanity in sin, is marked by this sort of cyclical cycle of violence where people strive with each other, where nations go to war, where systems conflict, and where in the midst of all of this, the poor are denied the things they need. Wealth inequality is exacerbated, unhelpfully and unnecessarily, and people suffer and die because of it. The four horsemen here, like I said, are not single literal beings that we think of coming at some point in the future to do these things one time. War and violence and inequality and unfair death are realities of creation, and they're what the Lamb is coming to save creation from. The horsemen, like I said, aren't a single future event. They're not necessarily this one thing we should be afraid of coming in the future. They're descriptions of the world that we live in now, the world being destroyed by sin from God's perspective. What to us look like these big, abstract, unthinkable, just systems that we can't have anything to do with. God sees these almost demonic, evil entities that exist because of sin and whose end result are suffering and death and exploitation. I mentioned at the beginning of the study that commentary on Revelation I was using and liked a lot was Alan Bozak's book, Comfort and Protest, The Apocalypse of John from a South African Perspective. This is the one that he was the apartheid civil rights leader who wrote this commentary while he was in jail. And he says this when he's writing about the passage here, these first four seals being opened. See, John tells the church how true it is that the wages of sin is death, the continued exploitation of the poor, the oppression of the meek and the lowly shall not go unchallenged or unpunished. God does indeed judge the nations, and sometimes his judgment takes the form of the inevitable results of people's unwillingness to heed the voice of God. There are clear and predictable consequences for the world if human beings continue to exploit the earth and plunder its resources, to exploit, oppress, and dominate the weak and the poor for the sake of greed and the hunger for power, to depend on ever-rising levels of violence and ever more lethal instruments of death and destruction in order to secure positions of power and privilege. Many may see the lessons of history. For John and the church, it is the voice of God speaking to the church and the world through these historical lessons and events. So as the Lamb opens the seals, we start to see the problems the Lamb is trying to address, personified by these warlike figures the Lamb is ultimately going to defeat. And it paints a very, obviously, kind of bleak picture of the earth. The world is sort of being just destroyed by sin, and we might ask, where are God's people in this? It just sounds like everyone, regardless of anything they do, are so caught up in these powers of sin, these systems of sin, that there's not really any hope for any individual person, even the Christian. But as it becomes clear as we go on now, as the Lamb opens the fifth of these seven seals, leading up to the unveiling of God's plan, God is preserving his people in the midst of this violence, this destruction, this disease, this pestilence. And it's in an interesting way. So to go on in verse 9, when the Lamb opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God, for the testimony they had given. And they cried with a loud voice, Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood and the inhabitants of the earth? And they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer, until the number would be complete, both of their fellow servants and of their brothers and sisters, who were soon to be killed as they themselves have been killed. So this is, I think, another way that we can see what's happening here and what's going to happen for sort of most Revelation as being sort of super historical descriptions of kind of all of world history and its cycles. Those who are followers of God, who have been caught up in these systems, not because of their own deeds, but because the world is ultimately fallen, we get to see here with God in heaven. And this is really interesting. It's actually one of the only places in all the Bible where we get any sort of description of believers in heaven. Um, and it's an interesting picture here because the believers in heaven with God um, are with God. One, we do get to see them here in this sort of heavenly temple with God and living creatures and the elders worshiping Him. But we also see them intimately aware of what's happening on the earth and exhorting God, still praying to God, even from heaven, to enact this plan to better creation in the world. The people are there with God, but they're also still waiting for God's plan to be fulfilled. I don't want to say that it's that their existence isn't perfect, but the heavenly existence we see the departed members of the church living here in Revelation is one where even with us, they are waiting for heaven and earth to be, reunited as God's plan is put together. The church in heaven waits with us for the perfection of the earth. But it's also something of a sad image because we see these people in heaven asking God for justice, asking God to fix the world, to right these wrongs. And we see God telling them, wait a little while longer. It's not the time to do that yet. I want to go again to Bosak talking on this passage, and another bit I like where he says in his book, the replies these people receive can hardly be called comforting, or so it seems. They are told to wait a little longer, to endure yet more suffering, to continue to pay the price. No propaganda, no cheap demagoguery or empty bravado of the sort we hear on the radio and the television day after day. There are no long-winded speeches full of self-pity and threats and yet another attempt by the leader to cover up their fear and mindless desperation. The souls under the altar are told the simple truth. The battle is on, and it's not over yet. The price is high, but the end is near. Endure a little longer. All they have is the white robe, that powerful symbol of certainty that victory is coming. He who gives them the white robe is the Lamb who sits upon the throne. So we're getting this broadening picture of history that's leading up to the unveiling of the scroll and the enactment of God's plan for the world. We see the world wrapped up in the first four seals in systems of violence and exploitation, the world being made a very bad place by the powers of sin personified. But we see as the fifth seal opened, God both preserving his people, but also telling his people that this pattern has to continue for a bit. The time is not here yet for these cycles of violence and destruction to be broken entirely. They are wait with white robes. They wait with people like they're going to come out soon in a victory parade, but it's not the time just yet. And then the sixth seal comes. So I'll read that, and it gives us to the rest of the chapter. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and there came a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, the moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain in the island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the rich magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountain, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, please, and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So the scroll that's being opened, seal by seal here, contains within it, when it's opened, God's plan to save the world, God's plan to put the world right. So it makes sense that the second to last seal, the last thing that happens before the world is made right in this picture, is God's judgment on sin, on sinful systems, and on the people that inhabit and prop up and promote these systems of sin, of death, of violence, of exploitation, and so on. The six seals here and the seventh that are coming are this sort of picture of history in a cycle. And the end point of this cycle right here is judgment. The horsemen don't win. The cycles of sin and death are broken here. I've talked about the way that richness and poverty in Revelation can be sort of a sign of one's allegiance. That John is very skeptical that people who are wealthy and powerful and influential in this current anti-Christian establishment, sort of anti-gospel establishment, um, have done so at the cost of their witness. That for John to be someone powerful in this society must mean that you have compromised or rejected the gospel outright. And so when God comes to set the world right, when the seal is broken, the people who are specifically come out and said these are the people who are afraid and shaken by it are, look at this again, the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful. These people specifically are singled out as being the ones who are the most frightened and the most distraught when God's judgment comes. God's judgment comes for everyone. It's not as easy as saying the rich people get condemned and the poor people get brought up. But it does specify here that in a society built on the exploitation of people, the harm of people, on death, on destruction, being powerful in the society is a bad thing, and it means that you should really be fearful, especially of God's judgment coming. And so that's what the sixth seal is here. It's God's judgment of these systems and God's destruction of sin before God's remaking of the world, the seventh seal that isn't open in this chapter. And that's the last thing I want to talk about here. And I know we're getting in kind of difficult waters. I hope this helps, and I know we'll have time after to talk about it. But it might help understand what's happening in this chapter and with these six seals on this scroll if we look ahead a little bit in the book and just talk about it. So we have these six seals being opened back to back, and something happens after each one. If you were to look ahead into chapter 7, you would notice that the seventh seal isn't actually opened in the next chapter. There's a long interlude that comes. There's a delay, a sort of buildup of dramatic tension before the scroll is actually opened, before we get to see God's plan enacted. And in fact, when in chapter 8, at the beginning, the seventh seal is opened, we don't actually get to see the scroll then. You'll notice then it's going to talk about some silence, and then this process actually starts all over again in chapter 8. Only this time it's called trumpets instead of seals. And that set of these 7 trumpets that get blown mirror this very nearly. So 4 descriptions of sort of the bad state the earth's in, a description of God's people, a description of judgment, a pause, and then a third restart of this cycle. This time it's bowls that angels are pouring out. So what is going on here? The 6 scrolls, like I keep saying here, aren't really one-time events that we can chart out as, okay, each of these things will happen at some point in the future, and then Christ will return to the earth, or anything like that. They're parts of a cycle that repeats over and over again, even here in the book of Revelation. Revelation pictures history as this repeating cycle that happens over and over and over in human history. And that cycle is humans reject God, humans embrace violence and destruction. God gathers his people together, and then God judges the world. And after God's judgment, eventually the people come back and pick up their ways, doing evil again, and the cycle repeats. Like I said, this happens 3 times in the book of Revelation. We see what we think is God's final judgment on the world, and then it picks up again. The people start doing bad again. God has to come back and judge the world again. It's a cyclical picture of history. It's something that happens over and over. And these images, the horsemen, the earthquakes, the church crying for justice, aren't one-time things. They're things that every generation goes through. Every generation experiences these totalizing empires, enacting violent systems, people rejecting God, people harming one another, and eventually God not allowing the people to continue doing that. Think of this from maybe John's perspective. The known world for the people that John is writing this to was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire stretched out as far as they knew a society could, as far as they knew anything existed. they probably didn't have much of an idea what was even beyond Rome's borders, if anything. Rome was all powerful. It was impossible to think of Rome ever not existing. And Rome was harming people. Rome was persecuting the church. Rome was engaged in slavery and exploitation and other things John's going to call out for the whole society. And eventually, in history, God doesn't let Rome get away with that. Rome's judgment comes. It may take some time for the church to be able to see it, but obviously, the Roman Empire didn't last. It's part of the cycle of history where the people get together, they get an eye towards conquest and towards taking things that belong to other people. They set up violent systems and they do violence and war, and they cause bad things to happen in the world: famine, inequality, oppression, disease, all of these things. And eventually, God stops the people from doing that. And this revelation happens over and over and over again in history, except that the seventh seal is eventually opened. There is an end to this endless cycle of history of violence and death and judgment and violence again. And that's what Revelation is trying to help us understand, that we need to understand our current struggles as something that are, in a sense, inevitable and not natural, but to be expected, that sin continues to cause violence and evil to come into the world, and that we can understand that these individual evils will be judged by God, that God will put a stop to them. But John also wants us to not only think of our sufferings as part of a cycle that happen in every generation before and every generation after, but that these cycles are going somewhere and are going to end. God will eventually vindicate us in our current struggles, but our current struggles also have to be considered in light of the last seal that will be opened, the seal that will eventually break the cycle. And that's what we're going to see by the end of the book. We have to go through this cycle 3 times in Revelation, but once we get through that cycle, we see eventually heaven and earth coming together in the end to be one united new world, one where the cycle of violence is broken. So this is a lot to go through tonight. Thank you guys for bearing with me through it, and really looking forward to our discussion of it.